sort of enjoyed and gotten up to date on the industry in the sessions in the morning. We look forward to your participation in this event. Just to add to the subject matter from the bank perspective, we believe that both the energy investments and energy transition require a balanced approach, which is predicated on the fact that there are players, there are economies, and of course there are people who are in different economic sort of cycles or economic margins, and hence everybody has to be carried along, so that we as global ambassadors of Earth and carry all the individuals together in their growth and in their success in terms of personal aspirations as well. I would like to hand over to Dayala so that she could moderate today's roundtable. Thank you so much.
Unmute myself. Sorry, I'm breaking my own rules. Thank you very much, Bedr, for that and for hosting this session. Of course, the topic of it is energy security versus energy transition, and we touched quite a bit on it in the plenary session about achieving this balance. How does the industry and how do countries indeed achieve this balance of continuing to supply the world with cheap, affordable energy, and yet making a transition to new energy or to making current conventional energy cleaner. Many challenges exist, and a lot of progress has also been made. John, welcome. I'd like to go to you first. I hope that you had a chance to listen on the plenary session, and a few of the comments also made there on the subject of where the money should be focused on. Between these two worlds, and just get your points of view there on how difficult is this challenge to strike the right balance, with keeping the world energy secure and yet not disrupting or interrupting this transition that started.
Thank you very much, Dayala, and thank you very much to Gulf Intelligence and indeed Mashreq for hosting today. It's been fantastic so far, and I look forward to the discussion. It's been really interesting, actually, to be honest, today. I suppose in my mind, it's not a question of whether we look for pure energy security or pure energy, focus on pure energy transition. They actually have to work hand in glove. I don't think you get energy transition without security. You don't get security without that transition. So then I suppose the question arises, well, how do you actually prioritize money? Where do the funds go? Because there's a large investment required. There's many different competing demands, etc. I suppose the way, and in so many respects, each country, each company, each investor is in a very different situation. So if you think about it geographically, you've got established developed nations that have infrastructure, etc. They obviously have their own demands. Some of them are very energy rich, some of them less so. You have developing economies in Africa that obviously don't have the glories of the developed world. So you got to look through many different lenses. And I suppose the lenses that I'm beginning to think about it is kind of one, geographically, where are you? Two, resources. What resources do you actually have to hand historically and moving forward? And then three is kind of, I suppose, your constituents or your people. What are they demanding? What do they need? And these three lenses can apply to national governments. They can apply to companies. They can apply to service companies like ourselves. Then you begin to think about it from a conventional versus low carbon or renewable. Where do you put your money? And I suppose what's driving conventional? Conventional it'll be one, I suppose, ultimately by who is the lowest carbon and the lowest cost. Look, conventional will be required for the next 30, 40 years, no matter what, even in a net zero environment. Then you begin to think about low carbon and renewables, and they've got a lot more moving parts. They've got uncertainty around certain elements of technology. They've also got a demand around the need for infrastructure investment. And when you compare and contrast that against conventional, where all of those are largely established. So you've got a lot more moving parts in low carbon and renewables. However, it's the way that needs to go. So if we kind of try and combine all of those elements and weave them together, then I think each different company, country, or indeed service company has to approach it in a slightly different manner. That's just some of my opening thoughts.
Thank you, John. Badr, just back to you from the finance perspective, obviously, and the funding perspective for these decisions to be taken. We touched on quite a bit in the plenary, but how much pressure, I suppose, is the finance industry under in terms of this balance that we're trying to achieve here? I mean, is our financial institutions ready to fund both prongs, if you like? Are they being pressured too much towards the transition in order to keep the former going? I mean, where do financial institutions stand on that front today?
So certainly, there is the continued awareness of the region's investors and the participants' desire to be part of the global conversation with respect to the transition, and hence that sort of education, that awareness has started to take place, and it will eventually result in higher pressure. I would say that the Middle East is both in an advanced stage in terms of transition, and hence that is allowing for the local conversations or the regional conversations to accept the transition journey, and hence the pressure isn't as much probably as you would have in developed countries or aggressively developing countries like China or India. However, it is still very critical for any business model, any business case to stack up, from a commercial point of view. What we have seen is that the commercial attractiveness or the commercial viability remains a key consideration for any sort of investment. As long as the investment first ticks the box on the commercial viability, and increasingly the importance of the ESG protocols, the finance is available. Now, if the second component is not up to the global standards, there is an acceptance to proceed with recommendations to achieve that ESG hurdles or those targets. So I would say, just to summarize, there is continued awareness, desire to be part of this global sort of agenda. On the other side, there is also awareness to make sure that the security of the energy for the region remains available. We have been fortunate by the adoption of the strategy that the rulers and the governments have taken in the region, which is evident from what what is happening in Europe with the LNG prices, right? The sort of disconnect in, or the lack of a smooth transition has resulted in this disjointed sort of market right now. So you have to carry this conversation. I think it's a positive conversation. In the meantime, maintain the investments in the energy transition, so that we come out of this with all stakeholders feeling that they have achieved success.
Thanks, Badr. Christoph, if I can just go to you on the question of capital investment into conventionals, and how that's obviously been lagging, it's been falling behind, has, you could arguably say, led to the supply crunch we just saw this year, amongst other factors that led to that. But how critical is this sort of urgency of, no, we must beef up this capex in the next 5 years so that we're not facing, these sort of price spikes and crises we saw in 2021 every year in the next decade? I mean, is the world getting the message? What's going to make that happen? If you need to unmute, Christoph, sorry.
Sorry for that. As we discussed a little earlier, it's far from clear that the gap is really as big as it is made to be. From the perspective of a successful energy transition, it's of course important to bridge it. And there are two sort of big general points in the background which one needs to keep in mind. The first one is, if you look at any kind of historical energy transition, and actually we only had two. We had the one from wood to coal, and we had the one from coal to oil as the dominant fuel. They were always driven by economics. That means the immediate gain of replacing one fuel with another was apparent, and so it was a win-win situation, and therefore it happened, and it happened fairly quickly. This one is different. What we have now, nobody installed wind or solar or biofuels or anything because they're cost effective, because it's not driven by economics. What we have now is a change in preferences. We don't want to be fried on the planet, so we want the climate change to avoid, so we want to eliminate carbons. Why do I make this in a long story? Because it means that we are now in a situation where we have to incur a cost at this moment in order to have a benefit decades down the road. And this means automatically there will be winners and losers. And this means automatically that all this hogwash that everybody will be better off immediately is just by definition not correct. And that in turn then makes it an interesting question, where do you allocate capital? But an even more interesting question from the point of view of those who want the transition to succeed, including governments, is if you look at the entire energy budget, how do you allocate it so that the costs and the frictions are minimized, that you can move from the carbon environment in which we are to a renewable environment? And the answer is, you do that by creating a situation where people feel reasonably safe and secure. And this is by actually allowing the overwhelming part of the system, the 80% which are fossil fuel space, to work and function properly and at reasonably low prices. It's a mistake in this context to think that high fossil fuel prices accelerate the energy transition. They will create resentment and they will attract investment into the wrong department, by in this situation where we all have to sort of tighten our belts to make the transition happen. And that's my second point. One needs to make sure that this gap is being bridged in a reasonable way, that doesn't emerge as investment gap, even if it's small, because it actually will hinder the transition. The logic that this will create high prices will accelerate the transition, economically speaking, is faulty. And from the social and political standpoint, it's now obvious, I think, that people just will take to the streets and protest, and that doesn't help the energy transition either. So it's from the social perspective, it's also faulty.
Yeah, and how important, I mean, from a sort of investment point of view, we made, Dr. Carol, as she made in the previous session, made a reference to the fact how the region, and Apikov also was touching on the fact that, the investment model has changed here, at least in the region, in terms of private sector, international investment being more welcomed, more attracted, let's say, into that, in terms of how companies and NOCs like Aramco are raising money or are creating revenue. How critical is the sort of PPP or the public-private sector cooperation, Christoph, to transition happening in a healthy way, in a balanced way?
It's very important, because under the conditions which I described, the prime target has to be efficiency, has to be as productive as possible and as energy efficient as possible. And that means to have renewables which can compete in their own merits and bring their cost curves down, all the things we know and we talk about. And for that, very often, large-scale investments are necessary, which will only happen if the private sector has sort of the cushion of the government and of the public sector behind it in order to risk these very large sums for a very long term. So I think this applies not only to energy consumers and consuming countries and regions. I think this applies perhaps even more so to producing regions and countries, because in reality, what we're asking producing regions and countries to do is like a dual task. We say, please keep the lights on for now. Oh, and by the way, it would be nice if you could lower your carbon footprint and have some solar energy in your deserts. So we're asking them actually to double up. And without some coordination and without some financial backing from the public sector, this is not likely to happen.
Jeremy, welcome again. Just your views on that in terms of who the onus should be on, if you like, in terms of trying to strike this balance. I mean, individual countries have to make their individual choices, obviously, and if they're producers, they're one thing, and if they're consumers, they're another. But again, just this question of who the onus falls on, and is there enough investment, going into conventionals and new energy? Is the balance there correct as you see it? You're on mute still, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for having me today. I think it's a really interesting question that you put. Who is the onus on? I think maybe I just start by building up on what was said by some of the other people on the panel here. I would take a bit of a different view on a few elements that were expressed. First of all, I feel that the cheapest marginal cost of energy generation in many parts of this world is clean power. I think that it's been shown time and time again in this region that solar is the lowest form of lowest cost power, and will be the source that is able to generate most economically during the daytime, and that can significantly reduce the amount of fossil fuels that are needed. In many other parts of the world, wind is a very economic resource, and so while I agree very much with Bader and Christoph that as our economy is structured, funds will go to the most economical solutions. I think in many places that is aligned with renewables and aligned with where we're seeing that transition.
Jeremy, just on that front, there's been a lot said about, again, we're talking about oil and gas companies also making the transition, investing in the transition, and the argument that, and what kind of transition should they be investing in? You're talking about solar, and that's been renewables have been a huge success in the last 10 years. The costs have come right down. They're undercutting conventional pricing just in some cases. So there's a success model, and in 10 years' time, we might see the same result for hydrogen, let's say, costs. But in terms of who should be investing in what, the responsible versus irresponsible capital discussion we had earlier, should oil and gas companies be going into the renewable space? Should they just be focusing on cleaning what they've got and leaving other companies to focus on new areas? Is that balance going in the right direction?
That's a question that's probably a little bit above my qualifications. I'll be blunt, because I see both sides of it. I see that oil and gas certainly have the resources and have the market penetration, especially in the emerging markets in this region, and they can make a big difference. But the investment profile of a renewables investment versus an oil and gas investment is markedly different. Renewables are a lower yield investment. They're a longer term and they're more secure. Oil and gas typically bring with them, at least on the exploration side of it, more risk, more operational expenses, very different investment profiles. And I think that some oil and gas companies are going to make a transition that's successful by convincing their shareholders that they can operate in a different yield and investment profile, and others won't. And that'll play out. My belief is that all of us, from the lenders, the leading banks like Mashreq, to the developers, to the policymakers, can guide the money to help with the transition, but they can do it by making sure, by setting up the economics in a way that they're aligned, right? And from my perspective, we work very closely with businesses on a day-to-day basis. As you all know, our conversations with businesses is how do we reduce your cost of energy? That's the starting point. The ending point is hopefully a cleaner solution. But I'm not going to get in the door with anybody if I can't save them money. So I think that all of us as industry participants, if we look at how we can make sure that the the new forms of energy, be they large centralized plants, distributed plants, or conventional. If we can tilt the balance of economics towards the clean ones, where they already sit in most geographies today, I think this transition is going to be an accelerating one over the next few years.
John, just to go to you on that point, and Jeremy mentioned policy, being sort of structured correctly so that we, government talking to business and kind of everything coming together on that front. John, I mean, do you think that in this region, let's look at the Middle East, that the policy directives, that the clarity on that is there now for the right investments again to flow in to this area in the right balance? We've still got in the work globally questions over carbon credits. How do you value that? They're not really being put into effect. Before we have that sort of policy support, can we expect investors to continue to pour money into the transition?
It's a difficult question because probably the biggest policy unknown or gap is really around carbon, the cost of carbon. Earlier on, Christoph actually alluded to as well. There's been two major transitions, one from wood to coal and then coal to hydrocarbon, and they were driven by economics. And unfortunately, this one right now is not being driven by economics. The gap is that as we burn hydrocarbon, we're actually not paying the full cost because carbon goes up into the air. Largely speaking, for 60-70% of the world, there's no carbon pricing associated with that. Hence, there's a gap in the cost. You see that cost in a sense on an overall macro basis in terms of climate change. However, you don't see it on a micro cost on a day-to-day basis to you and I. So that therein lies the economic issue. So until there is a global policy around carbon and the cost of carbon, it is a struggle to invest truly in just a decarbonizing conventional in the full manner. Plus building out the infrastructure for renewable. Yes, certain elements of renewable are more cost effective on a micro basis if you look per kilowatt hour. However, the intermittency, you got to factor that in, and the whole systemic change in the network. That's a massive cost that's not fully bedded out yet. So then to turn to the Middle East specifically to answer your question, Diala, it's no, the full policy is not there. The policy is there to support ongoing oil and gas. Yes. Is the policy there in a comprehensive basis throughout the Middle East for renewables? I don't think so.
And I mean, what about, let's move beyond renewables and talk about hydrogen. That's obviously been a huge, grey hydrogen has been around for a long time, but the focus and discussion around it has really taken off in the last year or two. And again, blue hydrogen in this region, because of the gas, is a natural one to develop. And there's been a lot of talk about green. Sean and his guests were talking about it earlier. But again, that's a huge investment needed there. How are these different sort of tracks meant to compete for the investment out there?
It varies literally almost country by country within the Middle East. So if you've got a cheap feedstock of gas, for example, in the UAE, can you transition it to blue hydrogen and ammonia with some ease and potentially have an underpinning business plan? You can probably get there, but you can probably add no less than $2 per kg. However, if you are trying to do green hydrogen, it's much more expensive. So, and you're looking for $5-6 per kg of hydrogen. And then not only is it expensive to produce, your actual user base is relatively limited. Today, the hydrogen market, the vast bulk of the users are in refineries and fertilizers. However, tomorrow's users are going to be high heat intensity industries, potential end consumers, transportation, etc. To build all of that infrastructure out takes time and costs money. So, and also going back into specifically for the Middle East, it's on a country by country basis is going to be different. In Iraq, their plan for hydrogen is going to be very different than a hydrogen plan for the UAE. UAE I think has got a much greater potential for capturing some of that market. The likes of Iraq, I struggle to see Iraq playing a major part there. So it's quite a granular response, really, almost country by country.
Better just to go to you on the financing front, and the I suppose appetite from banks like yours towards different types of projects. Is there a preference from institutions in terms of what kind of new energy projects banks are leaning towards? And also regionally speaking, is there, in terms of the rating a country might have, does that make a difference to whether you go and finance a project or not? Bahrain versus UAE, etc. How is the financial sector looking at that in terms of choosing where to put its money?
Yes, so Diana, I think from an approach point of view, this goes back all the way to policy. The clarity of the policy, the strategy of the governments play a critical role in finances to understand what the journey is going to be for every investment, right? If the policies are clear, as in the case with UAE and for most part of GCC, there is a laid out plan to 2050 to have 50% of the energy through renewables. That sort of translates into government action, and that facilitates investors to actually sort of mirror those in the financial modeling, in the hypothesis of the viability of those investment opportunities, and then it sort of carries on from there in terms of making those finances available. So in terms of the availability of finance or we don't see that to be an issue. Our colleagues from Yellowwood are sort of here, Yellow Doors, who have bear witness of that, right? They have been successful in raising capital. They've been successful in implementing their strategy, and Jeremy has been a stalwart in that sort of regards. It demonstrates that on the back of strong policy, on the back of implementation of that policy, you see success. Of course, there are other elements to it, the private-public partnership, the infrastructure, everything else also plays a role. But it all backs down to what is the agenda and how is it implemented to be a success.
Well, I mean, we've talked about economics being a driver always. It will continue to be. Christoph, just to go to you on that and talk a little bit about, it's kind of a policy question, but it's a country question. We had COP26 in November, and one outcome of that was still the sort of persistent criticism that the developed world is still not meeting its targets to what it's meant to be contributing to the developing world to help it transition, to help it with energy, and more commitments made, more pledges made as usual. But how much, Christoph, do you think, how much of a problem is that in terms of us making the transition in a measured, balanced way? Is the developed world ever going to meet its obligations to make this a workable transition? Mute, unmute.
So I got punished immediately. I started by saying, let me be frank. It became inaudible. But let me try to be frank. I think many of the financing questions we're discussing here, they are, there's nothing new about it. This is just, energy is just like the shoe industry in that respect. I agree with John. You don't enter the room if you can't come up with a good proposal on costs. I would add and a carrot for profits. And I agree with the statement from the bank that good policies is a guarantee. But all the things John said, I agree with Jeremy first. All the things John said are also true. And I think a much more important discussion would relate to what you just said. In my view, the targets which we have are unrealistic. I do not think that there is the slimmest chance of reaching the 1.5 degree Celsius target. Now, that is a problem, because when you dangle something as a promise in front of people for too long and then they can't reach it, what happens? People become cynical. People say goodbye to it and give or take a few cold years in between, and then the idea sort of suffers. And to me, the energy transition is such a huge and complex thing. And again, it is going to be expensive, because here's where I part company with you, Jeremy, because if renewables would be in the state you described, we wouldn't have had this discussion here. We would just sit there and the transition would proceed by itself. Fact of the matter is that modern renewables, wind, solar, geothermal, biofuels, account for less than 5% of the global energy mix. There's a huge way to travel. And fact of the matter is that when we look at these zero carbon promises by 2030, 2040, 2050 of companies as well as of countries, there is no way that we can see today how they can fulfill that except by buying offsets. And fact of the matter is that we talk about financing transition, these are the big unknowns. A huge market for offset developing, which promises to be one of the most deregulated cowboy market of all times, with all the negative consequences we have there, helping people to decarbonize. And so I think that, coming back to your question, sorry for the excursion, that starting with targets which are unrealistic will not do us any favors in the long term. That will create more hiccups down the road, against which the Yellow Vests was just a little beginning.
Yeah, I mean, those targets have not been officially adjusted, but I think the reality is kicking in. I mean, Jeremy, just to go to you on that, in terms of the issues that the renewable sector still faces, intermittency, storage, etc. What's stopping those from progressing faster? I mean, is it we need more R&D in tech? Not enough money is pouring in. What will make that 5% shift sooner rather than later?
I think in one word, it's storage, and that is what John referred to, certainly in needing to increase penetration. Now we obviously work kind of bottom up, and I think a lot of my colleagues here are looking at it from a top-down perspective. But from a bottom-up perspective, if we're talking with customers who are self-consumption based, they don't have a grid or the grid can't accept power, we can supply somewhere between 20 and 30% of their daily demand with solar, right? So we can move from that 5% point that Christoph referenced to a 20-25% point by offsetting their daily demand with solar locally on site. Will everyone do that? Of course not, right? There's a whole bunch of reasons why people won't. It's a long-term commitment to do that. So there's a bunch of dynamics around landlord versus tenant. There's a whole bunch of dynamics around business vision, how long you're looking out. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why not everyone will go that direction. So I think from a bottom-up perspective, the economics are there for people who have a bit of a vision. Now to move from 20 or 30 to 80, it's storage, right? It's storage that is cost effective on managing diurnal patterns of generation versus demand. And that bringing that cost of storage down from where it sits today at, let's say 10 cents down to 7 or 5 is going to enable us to make that shift. And I am optimistic that will happen sooner than later. Sooner, hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll see that. And that's going to be one of the major things. I think the other you referenced a few minutes ago is regulations. Our view is that if you're talking with a distributed generation world, get out of the way, regulators, let us do what we do. And I think there'll be a faster transition. I think the regulations are very important on a grid and utility scale, and there's ways to make those transitions, and that can incentivize money and provide security to Batter and the other lenders. That there is a long-term thing there, but on the local basis, it's actually less regulations could be better in many of the markets that we're dealing with.
Thanks, Jeremy. John, just to go to you on that, and just to look at the different patterns of across the world that we could expect to develop. I mean, you've got Europe, which has always been sort of at the forefront, if you like, of you could argue, the transition. Countries like Germany, other countries that have really, from a private sector point of view or even government policy, just been ahead of the game. Perhaps it's just easier for them to do that. They're obviously a big consumer as well. But you also have India and China. They're massive consumers. And can we expect any uniformity in terms of how these different regions deal with this balance, and how will that impact the appetite for finance? I'll go to Bedr with the same question afterwards, but John, just on your, is the world, by trying to discuss it all together, is it just too ambitious a thing to be doing?
Yeah, look, it's super tough. I think there's probably some global elements that need to be resolved at the likes of COP, etc. But largely speaking, strategies almost country by country will differ. Like if you take the UK, UK has been a leader in offshore wind market, and indeed I think about 7 or 8, 9% of their electricity now comes from offshore wind. However, 3-4 months ago, they had an electricity crisis where people had shutdowns at home. So you've got that's the UK. Then you look at China. China, big coal consumer, growing economy very quickly, very different dynamic. Then you look at Africa, again, a different dynamic. They don't have they've limited infrastructure, but they've got a right and a wish to have a great economic life similar to what we have. So each region, or indeed even each country, has slightly different demands and will ultimately go in a different path. However, then on the macro sense, you have things like carbon pricing needs to be addressed on a global basis. Super tough, I get that. I think Mark Carney said it'll take another decade before we get there. I hope not, because I think it could be a big driver to the right kind of change we need. But equally so, then there's the shift of, if we demand the developing economies to move in the same at the same pace as developed economies around renewables, etc., it's unfair. So how do we actually balance that equation? Those kind of questions need to be resolved on a global basis, where individual strategies must be done by country by country.
Thanks. And Bedr, what's your point of view on that from the financial sector point of view? I mean, obviously different institutions focus on different regions, but again, this sort of developing versus developed world finance, where do you think your sector should be focusing most?
So clearly, I mean, from an industry point of view, we agree with what John has mentioned. We see that there are significant challenges. I mean, in the region, if you look at, there are challenges with respect to stranded assets. Then there is the rentability of assets, which Jeremy was talking about. From the finance sector, or from the investors' point of view, I think the approach is simple. We follow the sort of aspirations of our investors and our consumers. We are citizens of the regions and of the world, and we would like to deliver on the aspirations of the global citizens. What does make a difference is the commercial viability, and how that sort of impacts the regions that the banks operate in. The classic example would be that Mashreq operating out of GCC will be more sort of acclimatized with the with the UAE or the GCC's sort of development towards energy transition. However, which an institution that is, for example, in South Asia, or facilitating their clients in countries like Pakistan or Bangladesh, will have a different trajectory towards their investments. So going back to what John said, every region, every country will have its own strategy, its own journey towards the transaction. And the good thing is that everybody is making that conversation. Everybody is part of that sort of dialogue, and we feel that as an institution, that there will be progress in this sort of direction.
Christoph, in terms of budgets and financing, if you look at just at the GCC, and if we believe in the surveys that we did earlier today, that people are confident we're going to have an average oil price of $70+ for the next 5 years, that's great news for oil producers who are clearly plowing ahead with continuing to maximize revenue from those resources. But let's do a scenario where we've had peaks and troughs in prices in the last decade. What if we see prices dropping again to $40 or $50? Do you think the GCC countries will remain as committed as they are? to the transition projects that they're investing in? How
Realist guesswork, but realistically probably not, of course, because you have priorities, and if you live in a GCC country as you do, you need air conditioning, you need water, you need certain things, and they have to be paid for. And if there's less surplus after that, then there's less beneficial things you can do. Again, I like to step back and connect to what the previous speakers have said. The way I view it is this is a costly transition, as I've explained earlier. And so it probably makes sense. You look at this whole, what it costs is an energy budget. And you want to spend as little as possible in order to have as much economic growth and development in the world on energy. And within that energy budget, you want to switch from fossil to non-fossil energies for reasons we all know. And this is where the regulatory function comes in. This is where international cooperation comes in. And so I think the questions of where should investment go is slightly probably the wrong question, because we have to recognize that there are some principles which help us to make this work. And the first of these principles is that we need markets for that, and that we need a private sector for that, because it requires a lot of innovation. I'd like to give you a recent example. Take the COVID pandemic. So what we had here, what happened after it was recognized as a pandemic, was this US sort of call to arms, if you want, to the private sector saying, Operation Warp Speed, you get all the infrastructure, you get tax breaks, but develop a vaccine ASAP. And they did it in such a way as to make companies compete against each other. And that part of the private sector, with the prodding of the government, succeeded in delivering a vaccine. So that is something, a page which we can take and which we can learn from. But then what happens since is that we now think that we could eradicate COVID or reduce it to the level of an endemic, something like the flu or so, if only everybody would be vaccinated. And the real problem, of course, we have is not those few percentage guys who are sort of with conspiracy theory refusing to get vaccinated in the rich countries. The real problem we have is that the poor part of the world is not getting vaccinated because they can't afford it. So here again would be a coordinating role for the government where we have failed. And this, I think, is pretty much the state of the world it's a good example for the energy transition. We know certain regulatory and other incentives which make banks and others invest and which make people experiment and try to, come up with the required new fuels and which we can mitigate the risk of failure. But we also have no clear-cut way of what John said, globalizing this whole process. And the one point, which is probably the most important ingredient for the energy transition, is also where this becomes most glaringly obvious. That is the need for a global carbon price. Without that, very little will happen. And yet, this is still very far away because nobody really knows which agency should coordinate that.
And I mean, how much of which agency? And I said, Mike Carney, the former Bank of England chief, is heading up this body, which is trying to get to the bottom of trying to how can we get to?
No, he did not head up a body for carbon price.
Fair and trusted system, and that we've already seen dirty games being played on that front in terms of greenwashing, etc. Not money, but actual other.
Mark Carney was heading up an effort to establish a market for offsets. Very different thing. And he basically threw the towel. He said, he saw what I said earlier, that everybody will require offsets to achieve its zero carbon targets. Every airline, every country, and it will be just like the same mess we had in Europe with the ETS, the early system in Europe, which came to be known as CDM, the Chinese Development Mechanism. That was the joke, because it was so obviously corrupt and it was so easy to plant a few trees in some country and then sell the offset. And he was worried about that. He said, this is going to be a market on a global scale, completely unregulated, completely open to fraud. Let's find a commission. They were doing this with the IEF, the International Finance Institute. And he basically had to throw the towel on this one because there were too many different participants with very different interests, from environmentalists to people who wanted to sell these offsets to people who wanted to buy them. It was not possible. It was a failure. It was not possible to establish a regulated market, to give some scope and provide failure when that takes off as a real need to finance the industry.
And I mean, so what would it take? What would it take to do that? I mean, what's the magic formula?
Look, we live in a world. The magic formula is in my view, is the long, thorny, stony road of international negotiations and agreements, and of rich countries willing to share the burden and to make some transfers, and of poorer countries to allow for some supervision and control and transparency on where these funds go. All these things which as a global species we are not very good at, but that's what the situation requires. That's how urgent and how serious it is.
Badr, I'm going to go to you for final comments and just and put a question to you with that, which is, how in terms of the international banking sector sort of competing itself in this finance space, are you feeling challenged in terms of the competition out there, i.e. other offers of funding? We had a discussion on the panel earlier today about irresponsible capital or new types of companies who are flush with money and able to throw cash at some of these projects, but not necessarily to have the background or experience of having invested in those areas, but perhaps are offering better terms. I mean, are banks like yours in any way facing strong competition on that front?
So, Diala, this is definitely a very competitive space. It is one of the oldest industries, for mankind. Yet it is extremely important, and we've seen that pivot required. You've seen, off late, the fintechs, sort of prominently coming up. So I sort of cannot deny that it is a very challenging and competitive space. But given the fact that the banks and financial institutions play an extremely important part in the economic success of countries, of regions, and they have built this ability to adapt. And we see that, digitization has been adopted across all players in the region, and that has allowed for us to carry on with the growth in 2 years of complete economic disruption. The last 2 years where COVID, nobody had dreamed that the economic cycle would recover so quickly, and the banks have played their part. So yes, it is a challenging environment. It is continuing to evolve, but I feel that the banks are ready for that, and they are making the necessary investments on technology, on human resources, on their business models to make sure that they are able to be active partners for all our stakeholders, be it clients, be it consumers, be it our investors, be it our employees, and that is what is driving us to change as well.
Well, thank you very much, Badr Chowdhury from Mashreq Bank, for hosting this session. I'd like to thank our fellow panelists and speakers. Thank you very much, gentlemen, again, for your input. Again, we've run out of time. Thank you to our viewers for joining us today and for joining earlier for the plenaries, and indeed for the entire day. And as I mentioned earlier, we still have a couple of sessions on this afternoon at 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. We'll be sending the links to those as a reminder to everybody. Love for you to join those as well as we wrap up our 12th UAE Energy Forum, outlook for the year ahead. A lot of food for thought that we've been given today, and of course, all of the material that has been on the record today can be accessed on social media as well. If anyone missed anything, on our YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter pages, and we'll be communicating with you on that as well. But thank you very much for joining us, gentlemen. Great to have you with us again, and thank you again, Badr, and thank you to Mashreq Bank. All the best.
Thank you so much, everyone.